Hello and welcome to The Road to Westminster 2015, a new weekly show which will count us down to the British general election on May the 7th. Opinion polls are showing an almost dead heat between David Cameron's Conservative Party, which heads the current government coalition, and the opposition Labour Party, whose leader is Ed Miliband. So with neither of the main parties likely to win an outright majority, the fate of the smaller parties, such as the Scottish National Party, the Liberal Democrats and UKIP, become far more interesting, as they could become the kingmakers in any future coalition. Domestic issues are likely to dominate the campaign, and whoever wins will have to preside over an economy which has been in recession for the past several years and is now experiencing anemic growth. Other major issues include the National Health Service, immigration, and whether the UK should remain part of the European Union. Here's a report by Faiza Ahmed outlining what's at stake on May the 7th.
After 7 years of economic recession and stagnation, UK voters will head to the polls to elect a new government. According to research, the economy, immigration and the National Health Service are amongst the top issues concerning voters this year.
I think the first issue is going to be austerity, although all the main established parties support austerity. But clearly many voters who've suffered the biggest fall in living standards in modern history in Britain feel aggrieved that the cost of austerity has been borne by ordinary people. Migration is unfortunately a major issue, with UKIP in particular leading the race to try and control immigration, and the scare stories which have accompanied that about immigration mainly from Eastern Europe.
The main political forces in the UK are made up of two established parties, the centre-right Conservatives and the centre-left Labour Party. Others include the Liberal Democrats, the Scottish National Party, the Green Party and the anti-EU and immigration party UKIP. But critics say the current voting system, first past the post, is weighted in favour of the two traditional parties.
I don't think it's fair, and a case in point is the Greens, who have consistently polled well across the country, but require to have an overall majority, or not an overall, but the biggest share of the vote in one parliamentary seat in order to win. And they're finding that quite difficult. They have one seat at the moment in Brighton. So the fact that they've got a support of somewhere 10–15% of the vote nationwide is not going to translate into any, if any, seats. And so that is unfair.
This view is also held by many voters who are questioning the fairness of the system.
I don't really agree with the whole first past the post thing, because say 30% of the people voted, say, I don't know, Conservative, 30% of people voted for them, 70% didn't, but it's still a minority that get what they wanted.
All systems have their flaws, but the way it's set up, it's quite ironic. The idea is that it should give you a strong government, but yeah, we have a coalition, so perhaps it would be better to move to a more proportional system, because at least then it would better represent people's views across the country.
But there are some voters who are content with the current situation.
I think it's pretty fair at the moment. I personally think things like if people use their phone, I think a lot of people don't vote, that for one reason or another sort of thing. I wish that everyone in the country actually had to vote. I think we'd maybe get a better sort of representation of the country in the way they're feeling.
Research suggests that it's no longer a straightforward choice between the Conservatives and the Labour Party, and that neither will be able to govern alone.
On today's show, we'll be taking a step back and asking a question that's rarely asked: just how free and fair the vote on May the 7th will be. The fairness of the election is something that most British people take for granted, but to what extent can the inequalities of the voting system and the bias of the media determine the eventual result? To discuss this, we have two guests in the studio with us today. Jakes Arnold is a former Conservative MP and is now an international businessman. Jakes was a private parliamentary secretary at both the Department of the Environment and at the Home Office. And Dan Poulton is a journalist, filmmaker and political activist. Dan is on the editorial board of counterfire.org, a left-wing political website providing analysis on the movements against austerity, war and oppression. Gentlemen, thank you very much for coming in today. Jakes, if I could start with you. A prediction on May the 7th, what's going to happen?
It's totally wide open. It's totally sitting there for the Conservatives to win, and that is why this campaign is going to be absolutely fascinating. A blunder by any of the great politicians can turn the election, but the fundamentals are very, very clear for a Conservative majority.
Well, you say that, but the polls are predicting dead heat at the moment. Why are you so confident that it's there for the Conservatives to win?
Because what the polls don't show you is a vast overhang of voters who've not yet made up their mind. What's fascinating is they're not hostile, but neither are they convinced. They could be, and that's where this election campaign is absolutely vital.
Dan, would you agree with that?
I wouldn't. I'd kind of invert that. Obviously, this is incredibly unpredictable, so it'd be foolish to try and predict it. If Ipsos Mori can't predict it, I don't think we can here. But I think really the big story is how come, given that living standards have been fallen, as Ed Miliband pointed out in the leadership debates, people are £1,600 worse off per year now than when the government started. How come, when there's been such a fragile recovery, if you can call it that Labour haven't been able to shoot ahead? Certainly if you look at the policy prescriptions of Conservatives, look at the policy prescriptions even of UKIP, you can see that actually majority of people don't support these. For example, majority want to see the NHS kept under state control. Majority want to see, for example, the railways renationalised and these sorts of things. These aren't represented by the Conservative view here.
Jakes, I mean, you're shaking your head there, but the fact is that, you know, the last 5 years has been dominated by austerity, recession. Apparently, we're coming out of that situation now, but people on the ground don't really feel it, do they?
Because what does it represent? Why did we end up with a coalition of two parties that were quite different in the first place? Because the hemorrhaging, the absolute nosedive in the British economy had to be halted and reversed. We were absolutely in a mess. The outgoing Labour government ministers said there's no money left, and that was the reality. We were absolutely plummeting. Over this 5-year period, the coalition government has managed to break the fall and build us up to the fastest growing economy among the G7.
Dan, the Conservatives and the Lib Dems, they inherited a mess, and they're on the way to cleaning up that mess?
Well, I mean, you can accuse Labour of doing lots of things in their tenure, but you can't accuse them of being in control of the steering wheel in, say, America, where the financial crisis actually started with the subprime crisis. Let's remember this was a global crisis, funded on a fragile debt-based system where debt was used to compensate for falling wages, which have been falling historically. So it was a global crisis that took root here.
But the electorate doesn't trust Labour with the economy either, does it?
No, well, and if you look at the economic prescriptions of Labour versus Conservative, there's barely any daylight between them is the reality of it, which is partly an explanation for why Labour aren't doing better, I'd argue.
Jakes, I want to move on because the theme of today's show is the voting system. Obviously, you know, it's not proportional. It favours the two major parties, the Labour and the Conservatives. The smaller parties don't get a look in. How can this be a fair system?
Because what you've first got to remember, we are a parliamentary system. What we're electing is representatives to speak for their localities for 5 years. That's what the whole system is about. We're fighting 650 separate elections in the constituencies. Now, in the case where the smaller parties are highly relevant to a constituency, they can break through, as they did last time with the Green member in Brighton. UKIP won 2 by-elections because their case particularly fitted those constituencies on that particular day. But the primary point is that local people are electing their spokesman for the next 5 years.
Dan, do you believe it's free and fair?
I don't actually. I mean, I think that if we had a devolved system where there was decentralisation of power control, then you could say, yes, people make their own local decisions. We have an incredibly centralised United Kingdom, let's not forget, which is very much centralised on the City of London, the finance City of London. This creates massive centralisation, so you get these big contradictions. For example, in the elections, say 8% of people vote for the Green Party. The Green Party won't win 8% of the votes nationally. That isn't fair.
We'll pick this up in a few minutes' time, but for the moment we're going to move on. Now, for non-British people and even natives of this land, the voting system here in the UK can be a little difficult to understand. So here's Faiza Ahmed. She's prepared this little explainer to help us understand how the general election will be decided.
The UK currently uses the first-past-the-post system to elect 650 seats into the House of Commons. Now, under this system, the country is divided into local voting districts called constituencies or wards, and voting takes place within each of these. The voters mark a single X on the ballot paper against their preferred candidate, and the person who gets the largest number of votes in each constituency or ward becomes the MP. The political party that wins the most seats in the House of Commons is best positioned to form a new government, and its leader is in the best position to become the new Prime Minister. If no party wins a majority of seats, you get a hung parliament. Now, in this case, the largest party may create a minority government, or there may be a coalition government of 2 or more parties, as it happened in the last election between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. Like all systems, the UK's current voting system has its pros and cons. The strongest case in favour of this system is that it usually delivers a strong single-party majority government. But those on the other side have criticised the system for being unfair and for generating major discrepancies between the number of votes secured and the number of seats won in the House of Commons. It is also said that it can no longer guarantee a strong single-party government. And the system is also said to leave small parties disadvantaged and is shown to create and favour a 2-party system.
Jake's just picking up from that report. I mean, obviously, the major argument in favour of the first past the post system is that it produces strong governments. But as we saw last time, hung parliament, coalition government. This year, again, predicted to be a hung parliament, coalition government. So that argument really is blown out the window, isn't it?
No, it isn't, because it is passing the ball where it should be, to Parliament with elected representatives who have the strongest possible ties to their individual constituencies up and down the land. The important thing is throughout the 5 years, you may get a snapshot of national party politics if you were to have proportional representation. What you would not have is that very, very strong tie of the Member of Parliament to their own constituency.
Yeah.
And in the British democracy, that's immensely valuable.
So it's like 650 local elections, to understand it that way.
But for the 5 years that follow, the Member of Parliament has his eye on the constituency and maintains that link, not least because his survival depends on it.
Dan, we did have a vote, we did have a referendum, didn't we, on the voting system. It was rejected by the public quite decisively. So this argument is kind of over, isn't it?
I don't think it is. I think it's been started up. And it's interesting, it's one of 2 arguments that people thought would be shut down that have opened up over AV and also over the question of Scottish independence, which I'm sure we'll come to when we discuss the mathematics of the thing. But I always thought that AV was actually a miserable compromise, really, actually the worst of both worlds. What it tends to do, a second or third vote tends to pull votes towards the centre, which actually would have propped up parties like the Liberal Democrats, who actually were some of the most, I would argue, the most treacherous in terms of their policies. Look at their U-turns over student fees, for example. Just
quickly let you back in, Jakes.
It was summed up by a young woman on her doorstep. She said she wasn't going to vote in the council election that day, but she was going to vote in the referendum. And I said, oh yes, what are you going to do? And she said, I'm going to vote no. And I said, oh, that's interesting. Why? She said, I can't work it out. It's all terribly complicated. I'm sure the politicians are trying to pull a fast one, so I say no.
They're always trying to pull a fast one, aren't they? Dan, let's move on now to the media, how the media is covering this. I mean, during election periods, the media tends to go very tribal, doesn't it? And they seem to plump for one of the big 2 parties.
Yes, of course, there's a lot of that. I mean, it's worth noting that there is actually quite a big discrepancy between attempts by the media to win influence in terms of politics and the actual reality in terms of what people actually
But they are very powerful, aren't they?
Yes, for example, majority of papers in circulation at the moment support the Conservatives, 70%.
Yeah.
In fact, as far as I can see,
Murdoch papers especially.
As far as I can see, there's only 1 year when there was a decisively pro-Labour political newspaper circulation. That was 1997 with the landslide for Tony Blair, which the Sun swung behind. But apart from that, it's normally paper circulation has been very strongly pro-Conservative, which is a massive bias in the political debate.
Jakes, the media favour you guys?
Actually, that's really history, because how many people read newspapers daily rather than get their information electronically? I think
it's moving to social media now, isn't it?
I think actually the whole thing is becoming far wider and far more disparate, and perhaps that explains the confusion and uncertainty.
But aren't the major media corporations just colonising social media now?
To an extent, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But if you look at social media, I mean, recent sports showed, certainly amongst young people, a third of young people think the influence of social media it'll influence their decision in the election. But actually, most people don't think that social media will. I think people understand that it's you still have a large organised presence on social media that represents, say, the views of whatever paper is kind of pushing that. But recent surveys have shown that the electoral debates are considered to be influential, more influential than the newspaper, which should come, I think, second or third in that list of priorities. So you get a sense of
but the smaller parties, what I'm trying to say is that the smaller parties don't really get a look in, do they, when it comes to the national media, or hardly?
Yes, it probably reflects the support in the country. There is an element of chicken and egg, but basically it's true.
That's a good argument, isn't it, Dan?
I don't think so, because I think actually a lot of the stories, if you look at the rise of the Green Party, which is a sort of elephant in the room, people talk about the rise of UKIP. The rise of the Green Party happened in spite of the consensus that exists in the mainstream media, which is pro-austerity, pro-war, pro-Trident, by and large. Despite all this, the Green Party were on ascendance. If there was actual democratic political debate, widespread debate in the media that was very open kind of culture, think of the possibilities in terms of people coming towards those more kind of progressive views, which is not to say that people are sort of slavishly listening to what I think people do make up their own mind. Their own lived experience is very powerful in these things.
But the fact is, Jakes, that you know, a lot of people are disaffected, aren't they? Especially younger people. They're just not turned on by the campaign, by politics in general. Well,
that was my comment about the vast overhang. If that vote crystallises, it can go one way or the other, and that's why this election's so fascinating.
Okay. Well, we're going to move on now, because we've had some people sending us messages on social media, and hopefully we can see a few of those on the wall in a minute. We've been getting a message from Cara from the UK. I'm going to read it out from Facebook. The elections will be free and fair in the sense that there won't be any vote rigging on the day, but that hardly means the British electorate has a say in how the country's run. Elections in Britain, or indeed in any Western democracy today, simply guarantees the survival of the system in place. Elections are only PR operations designed to give people the feeling they have the means to participate, but are ultimately just for show. So very negative comment there from Cara. And I think we've got another few tweet from Joe from the UK. The choices in the UK elections are just terrible. I have no idea how to vote. All pretty pathetic. And another one, I believe, before we finish on the social media. Jeffrey from the UK, there's no one to vote for unless you want poverty, hardship, war, fraud, lies and racism. All right, well, that's just a snapshot of the tweets and Facebook posts that we received, all pretty negative. Jake's, you know, kind of a response to that?
Well, I think all three are probably sitting in their bedrooms looking electronically. I would say get out of your bedroom, get out on the streets, find a political party and go and influence that party and also campaign for it. But
the assumption that, you know, I don't know who to vote for, there's no choice, that all the parties are the same.
No, they should get out, go and meet the different candidates. The beauty of the British parliamentary system with our constituencies is you can get at and meet your local candidates. Go and find out what they think, or go and argue with them. This is your opportunity.
Do the British electorate have a real choice? Is there clear blue water between the major parties, domestically, foreign policy?
Not between the major parties. I think you've seen what the writer Tariq Ali has described as the emergence of an extreme centre, of a Bill Clinton actually described this process of what he said was triangulation, where the main parties in America, the main parties in Britain, move towards each other in terms of the central tenets here. Pro-austerity, generally pro-war, that's been the consensus that we have seen. But we've actually seen that, especially in Europe, there are big challenges to these kind of ideas. The challenge happened in Greece. Look at the collapse of the Greek equivalent of the Labour Party, PASOK. They supported austerity when they were in government. They shrunk from 40% support to about 3, 4, 5% support. This will happen to Labour. If they get in and implement austerity, their support will absolutely crash here, because there are people who don't want austerity, and that's not reflected in the
I'll just let you come in back quickly, Jakes. I mean, but I know you were laughing, but ultimately, pro-austerity, pro-war, that's about right, isn't it? Conservative and Labour, that's what they are, right?
It's not that simple. Part of the problem is Britain is well on the way to recovery now, but our markets are not there. Why? Because the Europeans are struggling with this ridiculous single currency of theirs, which has caused absolute poverty all throughout the southern Europe along the Mediterranean, with the most extreme form in Greece. Until they sort out this single currency, which cannot work, the Greeks are going to continue in this situation.
Okay. Right, we're going to move on now, because I think we've got a few newspaper headlines that we can have a look on our war. This is from the Daily Mail. And it alludes to Alex Salmond, the leader of the SNP, holding a future Labour government perhaps to ransom, dictating stop to austerity in Scotland, and perhaps trying to get them to kind of retract on nuclear weapons, stuff like that, alluding to the fact that the SNP may turn out to be the kingmakers. They're predicted to get to about 40 seats in the next Parliament. And if Labour comes in, they could do some kind of coalition deal. Do you think, Dan, that SNP could really wring out some major concessions from a possible Labour government?
They could quite possibly, because it looks like Labour's going to crash north of the border. Why? Because they refused to back the independence campaign. That's absolutely wiped out their support. There's no two ways about that. The establishment parties thought they'd shut down the debate over independence. Well, it's come back, much like the alternative vote PR thing has come back because of the political situation, because of the disaffection. SNP is showing you can do things a different way, you can play to the left and you can get massive support. Yeah,
but Labour are going to be wiped out in Scotland, aren't they,
Indeed,
Jakes?
because what the referendum campaign showed up was a complete hollow nature of the Labour Party in Strathclyde, right the way across the central belt of Scotland. Yeah. You suddenly realise they were private little fiefdoms that had no relations with ordinary people. And the referendum campaign stripped that absolutely bare, and that's why, amazingly, Labour is facing the loss of most of their seats in Scotland.
All right, we're coming rapidly to the end of the show, but I want to get one more newspaper headline in on the wall before we finish up today. And this is the famous story. David Cameron has ruled out a third term as a Prime Minister. He says if he's elected, he's going to be serving a full second term, but he won't go on any longer than that. Has the media made too much of this story, Dan, or is he going to be a lame duck Prime Minister?
Well, I think the story behind David Cameron, he presented himself as a modern Tory, pro-gay rights, pro the environment. Those were the kind of policies that they got in on. That's created a reaction amongst the Tory party that feeds into
the right of his party. It's not very popular. The right of his party.
And UKIP have been playing into this as well. They, you know, he doesn't represent the unmitigated views of the Conservative Party anymore. He'll be out, but who cares about his third term? I don't care. What I care about is kicking out the Conservatives at this election, because austerity is actually driving the economy down and destroying people's living standards.
Jakes, David Cameron seems to be more popular with the public than he is with his own party. And secondly, he's going to be a lame duck Prime Minister for like 2 years, isn't he? Because there's going to be this leadership battle before he steps down.
No, he's not going to. He's standing for leading us into the general election to come. He said he'll serve the full period. It may be that a succession has to take place over that period. He will have done some 10 years by then. So it's quite a normal thing, so it's really not a great story. You could say the same for Miliband.
Media made too much of it, you think?
It's a farce. Parties are greater than their leaders.
And who will be the leader after David Cameron, briefly?
Anybody's
Boris
guess,
Johnson?
Not least the timing of when the contest is.
Okay. All right, well, thank you very much. We could go on, but thank you very much for coming in today and sharing your views with us. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks to all our guests, and we really hope you enjoyed the show. Join us again next week for more features and analysis in the run-up to the British general election on May the 7th. Bye-bye.